Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Dynasty Life today, I'm joined by Dwain McFarland, who's been on a lot of my other shows, but I don't think you've been on Dynasty Life. This is that very cool part of the year where Dwain McFarland, you're very, very known for like your redraft stuff, Dwain. Crush it over at Fantasy Life for years. But this is your time of year, like where you're evaluating rookie prospects. Your rookie supermodel stuff is very, very cool. Let everybody know about what you have coming out with the rookie supermodel over at Fantasy Life.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is my favorite time of year. And one, like we're coming out of the season. We love the NFL season, but it's the rigors of an NFL season. You know this, as much as we love it, you kind of have to be in a certain routine the whole time. And so now you get to break that routine and go into a different mode. So part of it is because of that. Like, okay, right now I'm in this new space. I have more time to step back and think about things, analyze things, and ask questions, honestly. And that's my favorite part, like is trying to do the discovery and the data work to see, is there something, we're missing? Is there something that makes sense? Doesn't always come from just ideas for myself. It can come from something I see from someone else that I think has a good idea. And maybe they haven't really gone in to research it, but they just, thought it off the top of their head based off things they're seeing. So always looking for things like that. And there's nowhere better to do that whenever you're trying to really grade out prospects, for the NFL draft. And it's just something that I've loved for a very long time. I love dynasty football. I have 2 home leagues that I'm in, Theo, that are over 10 years deep, both of them. So we do tri-seasonal prizes. And I mean, we do all sorts of crazy stuff in these leagues. So some of my closest friends that I play with, beat me. They beat me, Theo. I don't always win. So yeah, it's a ton of fun, but I have to try to find an edge on these guys.
You probably have more of an edge playing against strangers, Dwain, than you would your friends because they all know you do content. And it's when you get in these FFPC drafts, somebody might not necessarily know it's you. It's not like your team name is Dwain McFarland. But
Right.
yeah, the non-industry people love letting you know about it if they beat you in a league. So this is the year you're getting it for sure. Both those dynasty leagues. When is the supermodel stuff dropping at Fantasy Life for people to read?
Yeah, so the rookie supermodel itself will drop, the Monday after the combine. And so that's for running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. I don't do quarterbacks, guys, because I haven't found anything that's been good enough that's data driven, a data centric model. We'll talk more about what's in the model for each of these positions as we kind of work through some of these names we're going to talk about in the show. But I don't do quarterbacks. So you have running back, wide receiver, tight end. I just don't force it if I can't find something, right, where I'm like, okay, this is added value for people. So those 3 positions. And then I will have write-ups starting that week as well. So running back will be the first, position that I'll cover, and I'll tier out the players. And then I will hit wide receivers, and then I will hit tight ends. So those will each be, separate weeks heading into, well, actually, that'll be early March when I'll be doing those.
Bird's eye view, how excited are you about the 2025 rookie class overall?
Well, I'm always excited, right, about all the classes. I think there's always, they're all interesting. They all take on like their own shape. I think the big thing you're going to hear people talk about the most, right, is the depth of the running back class. And it really is deep. But I don't think it's an elite class, if you will. I've seen a lot of people throwing around the word elite. Now, for me, elite standards are really high. Like that's 2017, right? That's Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Leonard Fournette. These guys were absolute monsters, and they graded out as absolute monsters in the model. We don't have that type of class, but we do have depth. So there's going to be a lot of players that could land in good spots that are good enough to make a difference at the next level. So I think this is a good class from a running back perspective. If you're looking at the wide receiver position, Theo, I think it's not as good as last year, but last year you had 2 potentially generational prospects, coming out with Marvin Harrison Jr. as well as Malik Nabers, and then Brian Thomas Jr. ended up doing what he did, and he graded out well in the supermodel ahead of time as well. But those were some really big names, so we can't match that there. But the tight end class is also really good. So I would say running back, good class, tight end class, very good, and then I would say wide receiver class is probably average.
So we're recording this about a week before the NFL Combine. And for us in sort of this thing of ours, fantasy football, the big important days for us are going to be like Friday, where we get to see these quarterbacks. We get to see these running backs, wide receivers. Tight ends are the day before. So we'll have basically a 24-hour period where we're going to know a lot of the athletic testing numbers. How much will you go back and refactor in athletic testing measurables into like your initial supermodel rankings?
Yeah, they are a part of it, but they are not a very big part of it. I'll say this: tight end, it matters the most for tight end. Speed score for tight end is a significant variable in the model, 0.375 correlation to a player's first 3 years of production. So that's by far the biggest, athleticism kind of number that you would be looking at that does impact the model. So that's in there. Then running back would be the second most, and it's also really just speed score. Not so worried about the rest of the data points. And again, this is based off of researching all these things. Also looking for things that I think are really already captured, right, and other components of the model. We don't want to be repeating ourselves. But athleticism does add something. It's the least for wide receivers. Wide receivers, athleticism is a very, very small part of the model. So for tight ends, matters the most. Running backs next, and then obviously the wide receivers will be last. Now, the other part of that, though, Theo, is how it can impact things is really mock drafts, and the idea of where players are going to be going starts to firm up after the combine, right? These teams get to talk to all these players. Some of these teams care about athletic testing more than others. And so if it starts to move around draft capital, that is significant because we know the higher a player gets drafted, the more opportunity they're going to get in the league. Like, if you're a first round pick, you get multiple chances to fail. If you're a fifth round pick, like, you could be cut after training camp, like if you're not doing the things that the coaches like. So we want players that get that additional latitude thanks to that draft capital. So it can influence like in indirect ways.
Yeah, I think you hit on a number of really sharp talking points here. Tight end, yeah, you can't be an unathletic tight end. And especially with the trend where Dwain, when we were doing this 10 years ago, you had a lot more like 265-pound type guys. Now, especially with the 250-pound, 245-pound sort of archetype that have been extremely successful for fantasy, the Trey McBride, Brock Bowers size player, and you have a couple guys that size this draft, those guys especially can't be a step slow. It's hard to justify 4.7 and 240. Then when we talk about running back, yeah, we will see guys hit like Bucky Irving, who are day 3 guy. But again, we love seeing those guys pushed into day 2 hit rates. We just start looking at the top players in Dynasty at the running back position. You're going to see a ton of day 2 and some day 1 guys in that mix. And then wide receiver, the hit rates definitely change with draft capital. Even if you look at the guys that are drafted in the upper half of the second round versus guys drafted a little more closer towards the third, the hit rates change. So I agree with you. I think that a lot of times the combine can get us in trouble in fantasy football. And we should have a little bit of an idea of who we like going into it and be willing to sort of adjust with it, but not make it like the end all be all because the guy has like a exceptional 40 time or a vertical leap or something like that. So I think you really nailed it. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Dwain's going to reveal his top 5 running backs, his top 5 wide receivers, and his top 3 tight ends in the class. And we're going to hit on a couple of big topics you need to listen to for your dynasty process.
Hey, what if I told you there was a Dynasty app where you could get player lifetime values, evaluate trades, including draft picks out to 2028, compare the advanced metrics of 2 players, look up the sentiment, buy, sell, hold on players? Well, there is a mobile app that has all of that and more called the Dynasty Dominator, and it's $5 in the App Store on Google Play. This is my gift to you, the most affordable Dynasty League domination app available today. And if you already have it, the 2025 class is ready to download. Let's go!
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Gremminger with Dwain McFarland of Fantasy Life. Dwain, let's get after it. I mean, the Ashton Jeanty is a player we could do an entire podcast about together. Unbelievable player at Boise State this year. It's looking more and more likely that he has a great chance of being drafted inside of the top 10 overall picks. I think every time you see a mock draft, people want to push Jeanty higher and higher. Chicago at 10, New Orleans at 9, Jacksonville, Las Vegas, and certainly your Dallas Cowboys at 12 are all going to be in the mix for Jeanty. So we can all agree that Ashton Jeanty's awesome. But when we start comparing Ashton Jeanty to some of the extremely high-profile running backs that we've seen in the last few years, the Bijan Robinsons, the Jahmyr Gibbs. Where does he stack up for you when you look at him versus players like that at this point in the process?
Yeah, so in the pre-draft model, which for running backs, I'm not including, any expected draft capital. It's got a 0.69 correlation to future production, right? NFL draft capital is at 0.69. So essentially, I'm not worried about the mock drafts yet. Once I get draft capital, the model moves up to 0.75 correlation to future production in the first 3 years in the league. So just make sure people understand for running backs, I'm not including any expected draft capital yet. But 93rd percentile is where Ashton Jeanty grades out. I've got data back to 2017. The model incorporates a lot of advanced data components that really we don't have, where I can go back further than 2017, right? Because 2014, a lot of the stuff is coming from Pro Football Focus, for example. That was their first year to start capturing data for college. Well, you got to have multiple seasons of college data for a player. So 2017 is where I start this process. And so 93rd percentile would put him tied with Christian McCaffrey for being the second best player ever in the model behind Saquon Barkley, who grades out at the 100th percentile. So, I mean, he is way up there. And the way the model works for running backs, and again, this is all based on research, studying which things really correlate the most strongly with future production, then testing all those data points against each other to see where you've got potential just overlap, because you don't want to start double counting. I want the model to be as simple as possible. And then the final thing, is just really thinking about, when these things all come together, you really want them to be complementary. You want them to be things that help each other out. So at its roots, like the model, the way it works for all the positions is you've got production. It's roughly 40% of the model. Well, Ashton Jeanty was hyper productive. Like if we look at his yards per team attempt, and I'm calibrating all of that for his strength of schedule. I calibrate that for the level of program that he got to play at. That's part of like his pedigree and background. Was he recruited to a highly lauded school? Did he transfer to a big school? All those sort of things are all captured. But like I'm adjusting this production for all those different factors. And Ashton Jeanty, like he was just an absolute beast. I mean, and people know, look, the easiest way you can say it, like he nearly broke Barry Sanders' single season record, right? So, people know like this guy put up a lot of yardage, but the qualitative metrics are another component of that, right? So NFL film grades. So I use Lance Zierlein's grades because I need something that's public that I can actually go back and test and see if it's got a strong correlation to future success. Like I can't use people's stuff that's paywall, because then I'd be putting it in the model and showing it, right? And then people will be like, I can't give away other people's paid content, for free. So I used NFL.com's, but man, people crap on Lance Zierlein. He's really good. Like his correlation to future production in the league, 0.59, like his grades. So that's really good. So you folks that think that Lance Zierlein sucks, you're just wrong. He's actually really good at his job, better than most fantasy analysts that are actually trying to act like they know what they're doing when they're watching film for 1 month out of the year. And nothing against that. I love watching the players too. But we have actual professionals with long track records where we can test their data, and he grades out really well there. Another aspect that I use for qualitative is PFF, looking at their combined grade across rushing and receiving, and he grades out in the 100th percentile. Jeanty is Lance Zierlein's second best grade, like as far as a running back prospect, I believe, since Saquon. It's higher than Bijan Robinson. He grades out higher than Bijan Robinson in his grade from PFF as well. So, like, he's a really good prospect, man. And people, I know that they're a little worried about the Boise State thing, but the model does take into account the schedule that he played. It came out at the 34th percentile. And so he gets dinged for that, but he's still overcoming it, because the way the model works is what's he doing over expected based on the schedule that he played over his time at Boise State. So, yeah. Ashton Jeanty, absolute amazing prospect. I would say as a receiver, Theo, like not on the level of the CMCs, the Alvin Kamara's, those guys. He's a notch below, but he's one of the best runners that we've seen. But he is a plus in the passing game. Like he's not going to be a guy that, oh my God, like he's a liability in the passing game. I think you put him on a team that really only has one good wide receiver or tight end, he could still be good enough to be like a 16-17% target share guy. You put him on a team that's loaded, like the Eagles, for example, and what Saquon had to deal with. You've got a tight end and two wide receivers, probably more of a 10 to 12% kind of guy. So landing spot will matter a little bit for him in the passing game. Not going to be like a CMC or a Kamara where they're just going to demand a 15 to 20% target share no matter what team they're on.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about ability as a receiver, Jeanty, we saw it in 2023, and then this year they just chose not to use him in that sense because he's ripping off all these long explosive runs and running for 200 yards every single game. But he's a good enough receiver, and this was a sort of a off year where the RB1 overall didn't hit with a high number of receptions. Usually we want to see a guy who's getting 70 or so receptions. Certainly the Jonathan Taylor year where he was RB1 overall. This past year with Saquon Barkley. There's been a few where it's a little bit lower, but I think in the right landing spot, Ashton Jeanty can be a 60 reception a year guy quite easily just on dump offs and his utility as a route runner. So I don't have any concerns about him as a receiver. I think that's sort of the one knock. The other knock that a lot of people try to put in Jeanty is this we're trying to nitpick. We're trying to find a little things here and there, is the amount of volume he handled as a collegiate. Does that concern you at all?
No.
No, me neither.
Zero.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't have any correlation to anything in the future. Zero. There's nothing there.
Yeah, for sure. And let's say that there is when we're talking about the pre-NFL draft dynasty rankings, I think a lot of people have Ashton Jeanty among running backs somewhere right behind the Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson. Then you come up with a kind of a choice where, is Ashton Jeanty the RB3? Is he 4? Is he 5? Anyway, you cut it, he's very, very high up.
If he lands in Dallas, you can put him at 2, and I won't argue.
There you go. That's my question for you. What's your dream spot for him that would push him in Fuego, not only in the dynasty market, but you could see him end up being like the 6th overall pick in redraft type deal? Dallas would be the spot for you, Dwayne?
Yeah, I mean, look, anywhere where he doesn't have a really strong incumbent in front of him that would create this, potential 50-50 situation for a year or two, like what Jahmyr Gibbs is dealing with in Detroit. Anywhere that he lands that doesn't have that, right? It doesn't really matter to me which team. Obviously, we'd rather it be a team that we think could be good offensively to give him more chances to score touchdowns, those sort of things. We'd prefer it to be a team that has a really good offensive line. But ultimately, you put this player in, I would say, about half the backfields, I would expect him to take over pretty quickly. There are certain landing spots, though, and you know how this stuff goes, Theo.
New Orleans,
we really want to dodge these things, but man, sometimes, especially if a player slides down a draft board, right? And suddenly they're sitting there, and even though the team has a good running back, they're just going to say, well, this guy's too good to pass up. We're going to take, scenarios like that could play out. But ultimately, as long as he lands somewhere where we don't have basically, if he lands anywhere that doesn't already have a stud, right? That's what I would say. We're going to be fine with Ashton Jeanty. But if it's very clear, like Dallas, I do think you could grade him as high as, like I mentioned, the running back 2. You could grade him as high as the running back 1, to be honest, period, starting in a redraft this year.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think that's sort of the scenario that would be very troublesome for initial success, and I think is in the wheelhouse of him being selected, would be that New Orleans spot at 9. You do bring up the fact that he's graded as the top offensive player in the draft for a lot of very smart film analysts. I just think New Orleans at 9, if there's not a quarterback for them this offseason, they might just take the best offensive player available. They still have Alvin Kamara back next year. That would be sort of like the buzzkill spot where we'd have to be a little bit patient before we could envision Jeanty being in the mix for redraft 101 type. But a lot of these landing spots, he will go in Fuego. Chicago at 10 would be phenomenal for him. I think he'd be the offensive focal point for a guy we know what he's doing in Ben Johnson. I think Jacksonville, with what we've seen from Liam Cohen, would be an incredible landing spot. So a lot of them. But Dallas at 12, that's the nut spot. And it's sort of like Emmitt Smith, Tony Dorsett, Zeke Elliott, Ashton Jeanty, sort of the legacy pick for Jerry Jones. You can just see it now. That's the one, would be the number 1 jersey sale in the NFL next year too. How about running back 2? We talk about the quality of this class and the depth. You're not going head over heels 2017, but you're still excited about some of the guys towards the top. Who would be your RB2 in your supermodel?
Yeah, and just to give people context real quick, so the 60th percentile, there's not just a line of demarcation, but if you get the grade of 60 or better in the pre-draft model, like that's essentially around the line where you're looking at, you've got a really good chance to be successful in the NFL. And so there are 8 of those guys in this class. Most classes, you're going to have 4 or 5. We've had several classes that have 6 or 7. So that's why I'm not calling it elite. It's in the range of some of the better depth classes, but it's not quite as good up top. Like we don't have 2 or 3 really good players. Like 2017 is an elite class. This is a good class with a chance to become really good because there are so many good players. Some of them have to land in good landing spots, right? And so that is going to help us out as well. And I think that's the beauty of this class is there's so much depth that at least 3 or 4 of them should land in spots where they're going to have a real chance to compete for some pretty big volume early in their career. Now, whether or not they'll be able to, hold on to that long term will also depend on like how far do these guys get pushed down the draft board because there's so many of them. If everybody starts saying, I'm just going to wait on running back, okay, well, then that pushes a guy down to round 5 that maybe would have normally been a round 4 or round 3 pick. It doesn't seem like it matters today, but ultimately it will because, say, a new GM comes in. We don't got nothing invested in this other guy. We're going to take another running back in the next year in round 2. So this stuff does all start to kind of combine. But back to your question, for me, it is TreVeyon Henderson, this number 2. And he's sitting there with a grade of 70. I think with TreVeyon, you look at him, the program quality, so pedigree, a big thing, in the model, 90th percentile. And what I'm looking at for that is I look at the FPI, or you can go over to ESPN and you can look at the the quality index. That's what I'm using. And then I look at the strength of schedule, all those things. So those things all grade out really good for TreVeyon. And the other thing that accounts for, right, is typically you're playing on these really good programs. You're playing, it's loaded. Like you're playing with all these other good players. We got Quinshon Judkins that you're sitting there having to share time with. So Henderson grades out from that aspect, and that helps him because his production numbers are okay. They're not great. But then whenever you start to dig a little bit deeper into the quality, like he gets a good grade from NFL.com. If you look at his combined grade from PFF, the qualitative stuff is all pretty strong on TreVeyon Henderson. So when you get to that 70th, percentile, that's a really good thing for you in fantasy land. If you look at the model hit rates without draft capital in them, which is what we're talking about today, guys that get up over that number, Theo, I mean, we're talking about 55% of them, and this is actually just getting over the 60th percentile. 55% of them are a top 24 running back within their first 3 seasons. 30% are top 12 guys. Okay. If you look at the 75th percentile and higher, which TreVeyon's just missing, now you get into that territory where 91% of them became top 12 producers in their first 3 years. 55% of them went on to be top 6. So he's not in that group like Jeanty. He's a 2 tiers down from that, essentially. But he is my next guy in the model. And obviously, the big playmaking ability is the thing there. And I think he's got better receiving chops than people realize. So I look at a guy, I look at him, Theo, and I think Achane. I think these guys that were, in situations in college where they did have to share a little bit more of the time, but they played for good programs and they've got a lot of the underlying traits you look for. I think he's going to test really well. Again, testing's not huge in the model, but it's part of what we're looking at for running back. So TreVeyon could move up with an absolute fantastic combine.
Yeah, I think TreVeyon's one where there's a lot of people that have him as their RB2 right now. That 70% number you mentioned, just to put it in context, who are a few other players in recent drafts who had a very similar range to Henderson?
Yeah, so I mean, Achane was one of them. He was sitting there, at the 68th percentile 2 years ago. If you look at last year, Jonathan Brooks, who obviously, unfortunately, tore his ACL again, was coming off the injury. He's a guy I liked a lot. He had the grade of 70. So guys like that, right? These are explosive playmakers, had to share their backfield with other good players, but we know that they have the underlying traits and their qualitative metrics are helping push them up in the model. Their raw production, right, is not as strong, but once you look at the program they played for and you understand some of the context, which the model's taking into account, they still grade out really well in the model.
There's been some popular mock drafts recently projecting TreVeyon Henderson into the first round of the NFL draft. Let's say he ends up in a Denver or a Minnesota, where obviously there'd be an Aaron Jones, but opportunities to be the high-value touch guy in what should be a very good offense. Denver sort of wheels up Javonte Williams' target share and just give him the Javonte Williams usage, and I think TreVeyon Henderson to the moon rookie year. What would you consider with Henderson if he does end up getting that elite first-round draft capital?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at him, like he's got the body type to take on a larger role than what we saw in college. And I'm not huge on size. Like a lot of people get so hung up on different weight thresholds. I think they do matter some, but we're playing in a league now where we're seeing more and more of these guys that are smaller than TreVeyon Henderson handle really big workloads. So when I look at TreVeyon, like I like the fact that, right, he's over 200 pounds. I like the fact that he's got these athletic traits. I like the idea of putting him somewhere like Denver where you're going to get schemed up screen plays. You know, nobody schemes up more screens to the running backs than, you know, Sean Payton. Now you're gonna have to deal with the idea that Sean Payton wants to use 3 backs all the damn time. Like, so that can sometimes be an issue, but like he could be like an Alvin Kamara his rookie season. I mean, Alvin Kamara graded out 70. He had a 72 coming out in the pre-draft model back in 2017. So TreVeyon doesn't have near the underlying data points as far as his ability. Like if you look at his targets per route run, yards per route run, nowhere near what we saw from Kamara, but you could see a guy like, to your point, Sean Payton unlocking more for TreVeyon Henderson in the passing game. So yeah, I think TreVeyon can force a timeshare in a lot of places right away. If he does land somewhere and he's a first round pick where it's got a clear runway, yeah, I mean, I think he's going to be I think he'll have a chance to be an absolute beast.
Yeah, real ones remember Alvin Kamara rookie season. So, Dwayne, when you say that one, I know the two of us both had exposure to him in some high-stakes leagues that year. Anybody who remembers Kamara as a rookie, unbelievable production. That was the year that it was like the dream scenario for a two-headed backfield where you had both him and Mark Ingram both finishing as RB1. So when you say Alvin Kamara rookie year associated with TreVeyon Henderson, you're certainly going to get people very, very excited. Let's talk about rounding out your top 5. Give us a couple of ideas. First of all, rank them out and let us know just very, very quick thoughts on the next 3 running backs for you.
I'm going to extend it a little bit past 3, but the
it.
reason why is because, like, folks, like, what I would say is don't get hung up on someone having a grade like of 2 or 3 points better than the next person. Think of these guys like in groups. And if you hear someone's graded at a 68 and another person's at a 65, those are really close, right? I mean, and so if you like one more than the other, fine. That's totally okay. The model is built to help us paint a range of outcomes for players based on things that have been the most predictive for future success. But it's not, just, it's got to be the exact, this guy grades 1 point ahead of the next. So we've got Amarian Hampton comes in third. Theo, he graded out as a 68. And obviously he's a guy that graded out really well as what he did, on the ground, but he's an adequate pass catcher, right? He's not going to be a liability in the passing game. He's not going to come in and demand looks in a passing game, but those guys are pretty rare. So I like him. He's got a lot of the things that the model likes coming out of North Carolina. Then we've got Quinshon Judkins, who is number 4. He grades out at a 65, shared the backfield, obviously with TreVeyon Henderson. We're talking about Ohio State here. Started off at Ole Miss, ended up transferring over to Ohio State. But when you look at Judkins, just right there below what we have for TreVeyon Henderson, if you're looking at, some of the backs that, are a little bit more well-rounded, like he checks several boxes, right? He's not like elite in any one category, but he checks off well in multiple categories. And then Dylan Sampson, like this is a guy that grades out as my 5th best running back out of Tennessee. Obviously, you had Jalen Wright coming out of there the year before. So another one of these guys coming from a pretty good program, played against tough competition, and had to battle, another player that got drafted in last year's NFL draft 4 touches. So the model recognizes that, and it's giving Dylan Sampson credit for that. So he comes in next. We'll see what happens with the athletic testing. Then we have Cameron Scatabo. He's coming in at a 62. And then we have Kaleb Johnson as well as Bashul Tootin are both graded out at a 60. Now, Kaleb Johnson is like the film love of everyone. And I really like Kaleb Johnson too, but people see it. Like I shared it on Twitter. I just shared all these names and they saw, oh man, Kaleb Johnson at a 60. What you have to realize, guys, again, a 60 is a good score in the model. You're at the threshold where you're likely going to be a good running back in the NFL, especially if you land somewhere where you get an opportunity early. So those guys are all really close, and landing spot will matter. Draft capital is going to change these things. The model moves to almost a 0.75 correlation to future production once we add draft capital in. Remember, it set it basically a 0.7 before the draft. So those sort of things are going to shake up the way these guys all look. But in the pre-draft model, these are the players. That's kind of where I look at it. Now, you've got some names below that. We won't go through all of them, but are borderline. RJ Harvey Jr., Trevor Etienne is being underrated. Devin Neal, Ollie Gordon, those guys are all right there. They almost made that 60th percentile. Depending on how they do at the combine, that's going to change things a little bit. And then again, NFL draft capital, once I add that to the model, it'll shake some of these players up. I will say Tootin is the guy that the model is way higher on than the NFL. He grades out number 7 for me. If I were to include his expected draft capital, which right now is sitting in round 5, I think that's going to move up after the combine. He would rank 12th. So 5 spots, the model has Tootin ahead. It's got him in the same tier with Kaleb Johnson, which a lot of people look at that, Theo, and they get mad. Guys, don't get mad. Just remember, like, this thing's just looking at all the different data points. If you like Kaleb Johnson more, that's totally fine. Like, when you're just watching him, I get it. But it's just telling you, like, don't sleep on a guy like Bijan Tootin. He has a lot of things the model likes.
Very interesting. Just so to wrap it up, your model: Ashton Jeanty, TreVeyon Henderson, Omarion Hampton, Quinshon Judkins, Dylan Sampson, which is one. Let's take note of that, because I've talked about Sampson with people. He's a little bit polarizing, but very cool to see you so high on him. Another one of these kind of sub 200-pound backs with juice, big time producer in the SEC. Cam Scatabo, another sort of polarizing player. Some people absolutely love him, Dwain, and certainly your model is big into him. Kaleb Johnson, you got to at him. He's at Dwain McFarland on X if you want to get angry about it, the Kaleb Johnson ranking, but it is, of course, the model. That's one where, again, I think your model's also showing they're going to get the opportunity. It's a range of outcomes thing here, where Kaleb Johnson coming in at a 60, it's not like a
it's
negative.
Not bad.
Yeah,
it's a good score. Typically,
yeah.
I mean, again, in a lot of years, we don't have 3 backs that grade out as good as Kaleb Johnson. I mean, so like he grades out really well. He's in a range where you're going to get a lot of hits. And remember, this is looking at all the factors. We're looking at production, which is adjusted for all the things I talked about. Then you have the qualitative inputs, which are the film grades, as well as their PFF grades. So, I mean, we're looking at the entire picture for these players.
And then Bijan Tootin, which is one where, remember, you're hearing this first on Dynasty Life. Dwain and I are both predicting Bijan Tootin is going to blow up at the NFL Combine in terms of athletic testing numbers. So, Dwain, like, Tootin's a super interesting one. It's cool to see your model on him. And then guys that we are into, like RJ Harvey, Ollie Gordon, Devin Neal, and then you think Trevor Etienne is a little bit underrated right now. That is a player that I think has a chance to move up. Certainly he's one that I don't have as high up as those other 3 you listed in my own rankings, but very, very cool stuff. And just to put this in context, so Jonathan Brooks, you were big into last draft. I know a lot of people were. Very, very unfortunate what happened to him with the injuries. Two-way talent. I think what we saw with Chuba Hubbard last year, would potential for that sort of usage in a Dave Canales offense somewhere in the multiverse. We're drafting Jonathan Brooks in the 2nd round right now in our early best ball drafts. But who was your RB2 last year, just to kind of put it into context where a 60 would have graded out?
Yeah, so last year, the next closest player, looking at it right now, we had, to your point, Jonathan Brooks came out it was at the 70th percentile.
70, yep.
Yeah, second was Jalen Wright, who came in, 62nd percentile. And then you had Trey Benson graded out as a 60. And then you had Will Shipley, Isaac Garendo, Bucky Irving, Audric Estime really in that next tier where I kind of talked about RJ Harvey and some of those other guys. They were in the range of those guys. So last year, you only had 3 guys at a grade of 60 or better in the model. This year, you've got 8 guys. And that's what makes it a good class. It's not a great class because if we had 2 Ashton Jeantys or another really good player right behind Ashton Jeanty, you could maybe start to talk about, hey, could this be like 2017? Right now, I don't think it's any comparison to 2017, but it is a good class because of this depth and much better than last year.
Let's pivot over to the wide receiver position. Certainly running back is the position that people are very, very excited about, but wide receiver has been a position where rookies have been coming into the league and making instant impacts more and more often. We've had at least one wide receiver finish top 6 in PPR scoring in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. Last year, we had 2 of them with Brian Thomas and Malik Nabers. And then the only year where one didn't finish inside of the top 6, we still had Garrett Wilson being the offensive player of the year, rookie offensive player of the year. In the 2025 class, if there is a wide receiver that's going to give us this sort of top 5, top 6 PPR scoring outcome, it's which player and on which landing spot that would get you the most excited, Dwayne?
Yeah, I mean, it's Tet McMillan. Like Tet, he grades out as a 72 in the pre-draft model. He grades out as an 80 overall if you look at his expected draft capital. I will say for the wide receivers, in full transparency, the running back and tight end models have a stronger track record than wide receiver. So wide receiver, I'm going to go ahead and, like, when I mention some of these, I'm going to put their expected draft capital in there because it does matter even more for this position. So when you look at Tet McMillan, like, just one of these guys, Theo, and again, it comes down to production. It comes down to their pedigree. It also comes down to, like, the qualitative things. So still using the same kind of things in the model. Tet McMillan, not a guy that with the ball in his hands is going to, like, wow people, right? He's more like a Drake London. He's a possession kind of receiver, but man, this is a player that can earn a lot of targets. He's a player that can be a mismatch against, corners of all different sizes, not necessarily going to burn you over the top, but he is a player that, plays in that mold of like and I don't want to comp it too high, but like a Brandon Marshall, right? Obviously, we already talked about Drake London. Cortland Sutton would kind of be, potentially at the lower end of the spectrum for a guy like Tet McMillan. But look, he came out, earned targets a ton, did well, like as far as production goes, once you adjust for everything. If you look at him, with the ball in his hands, like, so I like to look at career, I like to look at the quarterback rating on their career targets. It was 110. So that's 57th percentile, and that's for his career. So, like, that's not in the range of Travis Hunter. Travis Hunter is an 83rd percentile once you get him the ball. And Travis Hunter would be the wide receiver 1 if we thought he was going to play full-time wide receiver at any of his landing spots. And who knows, maybe one day he is the full-time wide receiver if things don't work out at cornerback. But knowing that Tet is going to be the guy that's going to come in and play full-time wide receiver, he is the guy that I had to name as the number 1. And then if you look at it, the other thing, Theo, because ultimately I will say the model doesn't know that Hunter's going to play cornerback, so it ranks him number 1. But I'm giving you the context of, we know that Travis Hunter's going to play cornerback. So Tet McMillan is the guy that I would go with. But if you look at, Tet McMillan, 80th percentile, when I look at his adjusted receiving yards per team attempt index, and what that does, it accounts again for the schedule that he played. It accounts for the teammates he had to compete with. It accounts for how good or bad his quarterbacks played. I'm normalizing for all those sort of things. Because we know that these players all come from different programs. Like, if you've got a quarterback that sucks, like, that impacts things. If you play with 2 other really good players, that impacts things. So the model knows all of that, and it's adjusting for it. And to come in at the 80th percentile, that is the biggest production stat. Well, there's only 2 production stats in the model, but that one is the one that's weighted more. And Tet McMillan is one of the best prospects that we've seen since 2017.
Well, let's add context to that. Who are a few players in recent drafts? You go back as deep as you want here, Dwayne. You mentioned Drake London, who was a top 10 pick, who is now a locked and loaded second-round redraft pick in 2025, was a wide receiver 1 this past year. So that'll get people really excited. And I love sort of that comparison where Tet's a 6'5", 215-pound guy who I think will end up being, at least at some point in his career, a 150 target guy, which is super exciting for us. Who are some players that compare to Tet in your model in terms of how he's grading out?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, I think that's the best comp in the model is Drake London. The other guy that he grades out similar to is Rome Odunze. I think Odunze, like, is a little bit more athletic than what we're going to see from Tet, but like, they are in that same ballpark. Rome Odunze, he came out with a grade of an 80 as well last year, and that's after, obviously, we know what his draft capital was. With Tet, we're still using projected draft capital based on mock drafts right now. So really those 2 guys would be the ones that I would name. I mean, I think the big thing to know, more important than even just thinking about like what the comps are. I think sometimes, like, comps are great, but sometimes I think we get too hung up on them. I think it does help us like visualize things. But if you look at the draft, model, and you look at what it's done historically, if you get to that 80th percentile or better, that's really where things start to look good for you. as far as your hit rates in the future. And he's borderline sitting there in territory where, we could be looking at a guy that over 70% of the time they've gotten to a top 24 finish in their first 3 years. And over 30% of the time they become top 12 performers. So it's not like it's a guaranteed sort of thing. Wide receiver, running backs and tight ends, honestly, are easier to build these models around than wide receivers. So there's a little bit more variation within these tiers and a little bit wider range of outcomes for these players, but he is right there in that range where I would want to be targeting him. I just took him in the 4th round of the Fantasy Life draft this morning. We've got a mock draft going on right now. I was 1 pick ahead of Peter Overzet, and I had Xavier Worthy and Tet McMillan in the queue, and I went with Tet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to draft right now when it comes to Tet McMillan, because once we know that draft capital and landing spot, the wait and see it first drafter, especially in these early drafts, is going to adjust. There's always going to be people who don't want to embrace the unknown, but Dwain, you're a real one, and you know where upside's found, so you're taking Tet. I like that pick. Let's talk about let's exclude Travis Hunter. Very sad day when I heard he was going to the combine as a cornerback. I was holding out hope, Dwain, even though it wasn't kind of misguided hope. Who's the next wide receiver for you and in your model in this class?
Luther Burden comes in next. He grades out at a 66. And then we've got Emeka Egbuka coming in at a 63. So those are really the guys that get over the thresholds that we care about. Now, just below that is Matthew Golden. He's really interesting. He's sitting there with a grade of 57, Theo. But remember, Matthew Golden started off at Houston, where he had to play with Tank Dell. Then he moves over to Texas, where he has to play with Isaiah Bond, Gunnar Helm. So he's had some decent target competition, but he got to play for Texas. That's coming in. That's helping him, in the model from a standpoint of, his program quality. Now, it's only giving the credit for the 1 year that he was there. But he's an interesting player because, if you look at his raw production, his receiving yards per team pass attempt, not great, does not grade out well at all. But one thing that I like to look at in the model, and it's the other production stat that I use, is looking again at their quarterback rating on their targets. So essentially, we call that their wide receiver rating, but all we're doing is taking how well their quarterback rated on all the targets to the wide receiver. He graded out really well in that category. And that's almost 20% of the model. Because essentially, you want things that complement one another, right? Receiving yards per team attempt, that's adjusting for teams that throw a lot versus teams that run a lot. I also, in that metric, adjust for their target competition and other things I talked about. But we also need to care about how productive were these players over their career once they got the ball in their hands. And Matthew Golden, it was 120, which comes out in the 67th percentile. Now, a lot of guys that a stat like receiving yards per team pass attempt have missed in the past, Terry McLaurin, for example, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, guys like that. They've graded out really well in their quarterback rating when targeted. So I like putting those two things together. And that's what I was talking about earlier with finding things that they're two production data points, but they're complementary to one another, right? It's not just all overlap where you're double counting the same signal. So Matthew Golden, another really interesting one, also got a good grade from Lance Zierlein, also graded out pretty well from a PFF perspective. So the qualitative things look nice on him as well. So he technically grades below that 60th percentile, but Matthew Golden's a name that I really want to keep an eye on, especially if a team spends a late first round pick, which is what we're kind of hearing right now out in the mock draft world.
Yeah, and I think that we have to adjust where people in early draft projections and mock drafts, you would maybe see fewer wide receivers than you're used to seeing. But with T. Higgins gone, being franchise tagged, nobody's giving up 2 first rounders for that one. And Chris Godwin returning to Tampa Bay, the market is quite thin for free agent wide receivers. There's certainly going to be some cut candidates. But I think that there's going to be more teams drafting wide receivers in the first round than maybe some people are projecting right now. Matthew Golden's certainly one of them. Buffalo late in the first, Washington late in the first, Houston Texans at 25 overall. There's a ton of landing spots where Golden could land quite well. That's a player where I know Thor Nystrom, who came on Dynasty Life a few days ago, he had him, I believe, wide receiver 4. I have Matthew Golden as my wide receiver 5. So I think there's a lot of steam when it comes to Golden. Give us one more wide receiver that you're into in this class, or at least your model is, Dwain, right outside your top 5.
I mean, Trey Harris is another one. He gets dinged a little bit because 5 years, but production's good. The qualitative stuff is also good on Trey Harris. So if you don't mind taking a player that's a little bit older, like he'll be 23 and a half years old when the season starts for the NFL next year. That's a pretty old wide receiver prospect. I will say, just as a side note, like I've really tested all this stuff around the COVID year and all these different things, and we've got all these players transferring around, and still really for the most part, players that are good are still going to enter the draft early. And they're still going to, break out earlier in their career. So I don't know that I'm necessarily buying into giving players excuses because of COVID and things like that, but it's at least willing to note it, right? I'm willing to note it, that it did change things a little bit. And Trey Harris is a guy. The other one that I would say is Jaden Higgins. Jaden Higgins is another one that's really interesting for me. He grades out higher in the pre-draft model than he does once I add expected draft capital. So those would be two names. One name that I would look at, as well, that I would say that I'm actually lower on than what we're seeing would be Jalen Royals. So again, and that's just the model. I haven't dug super deep in a lot of these players. I just got through getting all the models finished up. I spent a month, going back and retesting and looking at all these different things. So just off the cuff, I know he's a guy that a lot of people like. So Jalen Royals is a name that I've seen a lot around Twitter lately as being kind of like a sleeper. The model is not that crazy about him in the pre-draft version. Post-draft, based on where he's expected to go, he's wide receiver 10.
So just to recap, Luther Burden had a 66%, Emeka Egbuka 63%, Matthew Golden at 57%. Give us a little bit of historical context to last year's class when we're looking at guys like Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy, certainly after the Nabers, Harrison. Where did those guys grade out, Dwayne, just to give some context to where you have them? Especially BTJ. BTJ is one where people really want to be able to compare because of his initial success.
Yeah, so Marvin Harrison was a 96. Malik Nabers was a 92. We don't have any players at that caliber in this class. But and Rome Odunze was an 80. And again, guys, remember, that's with draft capital in there. So Rome Odunze, we don't have a prospect that's grading out as strong as any of those three. But we do have several guys grading out in the range of where we saw Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, Ricky Pearsall. Those are really more the comps to this class. So we don't have that same high end caliber player. But if you go to the notch below, we do have that. And I shouldn't say no one's comparing to Rome because we just talked about Tet, they're equal. So Tet is in the range of Rome Odunze. If Travis Hunter were to be a full-time wide receiver, he would be grading closer to that Malik Nabers, Marvin Harrison tier, but he's not going to be playing wide receiver. I know, sucks, but overall, not as top heavy, but there are still several names that we can like. And there's several guys that are going to grade out in that range where we know you could still get really explosive production. And Brian Thomas Jr. being a great example of that.
Tight end. Let's pivot over here to tight end. And tight end, young tight ends used to be something where we'd have to wait on them a little bit, Dwayne. But the last two seasons, we've had two back-to-back tight end 1 overalls in Brock Bowers and Sam Laporta. Also, this past year, we had two players end up with over 100 catches at the tight end spot. Brock Bowers and Trey McBride both finished as top 4 all-time reception total leaders in NFL history at the tight end position. Just as a macro, should we be embracing younger tight ends more often? Not necessarily only in Dynasty, but also in redraft, early best balls, because of the upside these guys have had recently. NFL is a copycat league. Do you think more and more teams are going to look at these younger players' success and sort of embrace that?
I think some teams may try to, but ultimately it just comes down to we've had some really good tight ends. Brock Bowers he's a generational prospect. He's you can't think about him and honestly compare really anyone to him. He graded out in the 93rd percentile in the model. So we're just talking about an absolute monster. If you look at the guys we have in the class this year, though, Theo, there are some good options. If you look at Harold Fannin Jr. comes out at a grade of 79. We've got Colston Loveland coming in at a 73. And then we've got Tyler Warren coming in at a 63. Again, being over a 60 or higher is really puts you on the map as far as really having to have a chance. So, for example, with Tyler Warren, that's in the same range as a Sam Laporta. So if you did get the right landing spot, right, you get a team that's not, where you're overpowered by multiple other high-end pass catchers that demand a lot of targets. I think any one of these guys could end up being a really good tight end in year one. So I do think teams are a little bit more open to using these sort of players. And I think a bigger part of it is teams are more willing to play a non-traditional kind of tight end more often. I think the big risk with a guy like Harold Fannin Jr., he's got to land on a team where they're willing to just play him all the time. Because he really is more of just a receiving tight end. If he lands somewhere like what happened to Mike Gesicki, some of these other guys that weren't great inline tight end kind of prospects, that can be a problem for a guy like Harold Fannin Jr. So the landing spot is going to matter, but obviously, like, the guy was uber productive in college. And then if you look at Colston Loveland, he grades that slightly ahead of Tyler Warren just because, like, he did all this stuff at a younger age, right? He played at Michigan. Both of them played at big programs. So the model really likes both of them, but it does like Colston Loveland slightly better than Tyler Warren. I get it. When you just flip on the film and I watch Tyler Warren, I love him, right? But again, I don't let my film watching ability, Theo, bleed into this. This is the model. Like, I will talk about what I see with players in other, context, but honestly, I don't like leaning into it too much. Because I'm already using film in this from someone that I think is a lot better at grading players. It's their job. It's what they do. They've got a history of doing it, and they've got a strong correlation, their grades to future NFL success. So I'm talking about Lance Zierlein from NFL.com. There are other people out there that are also good, but again, like, his stuff's all publicly available, and I can put it in the model, and it's not going to be something where I'm giving away information that people want folks to pay for, like a Dane Brugler or something like that. So when I look at it, I try to separate. Like, okay, I see Tyler Warren. I think he's probably better than Colston Loveland when I just watch the two. But the model's telling me, no, we've already accounted for that with these grades from NFL.com and Lance Zierlein. And I think, you mentioned earlier the combine can get us in trouble. I think the other thing that has gotten me the most in trouble over the years, honestly, is watching film. And it's not that it's bad. I still want to do it because I love doing it. I like watching football. So I want to watch all these prospects. But I do worry that it takes over at this time of year. We've got people that are watching film for 1 month of the year. They don't have a grading process. They don't have a strong grading process if they've got one that they've tested over time. Like Matt Waldman's a great example of someone that does, and he gives you all this information. He gives you complete transparency to how he does his grading. And that's important, man, because you got to be able to go back and figure out what'd you miss, what'd you get right, what traits, right, you need to be looking for that can't get better once they get to the NFL. What traits can players actually improve on? There's a lot that goes into film watching, and so I try to remove that from this part of what I'm doing in the Dynasty season, just because I'm just willing to admit that I'm not as good at it, at people that it's their full-time job that have a rigorous process around it.
No, that's a completely level-headed way of putting it, Dwayne. But after we're done here, I'm going to pop in Tyler Warren USC highlights and rewatch them a couple of times and get even more.
I'm with you. I love watching them, and they're amazing.
No, 100%. And I think that the big takeaway here is your model has Harold Fannin Jr. number one at 79%, which is higher than Sam Laporta. Give us a couple of guys that graded in that 79, 80% range, just to give context.
Well, again, I think the bigger thing here, right, is looking at, the model hit rates. And whenever you get over an 80, essentially you're a lock to become a top 12 tight end, right? And then you're going to have a chance to be one of the top 6 tight ends. So I think that's huge. But yeah, if you look at guys like going back historically, just to kind of give some context, if you look at Brock Bowers, he came in 92. So he's below that, right? So he's a couple of tiers below where we were with Brock Bowers. But if you look at the year before, we had Michael Mayer, we had Dalton Kincaid. We had a lot of guys that were in a similar range. And Dalton Kincaid actually came in a little bit lower than where we have Harold Fannin Jr. And then if you go back the year before, you've got Trey McBride. Trey McBride came in at a 70, and that's a guy that we absolutely love. You go back another year before that, obviously we've got Kyle Pitts. No one wants to talk about Kyle Pitts, but he did grade out with a 100. So he does still have the best score. And then if you go back to the year before that, Albert O, going back to look at Albert O, wasn't a very good class that year. You had Hunter Bryant after that. So Harold Fannin Jr. grading out a bit ahead of all those guys. And then the year before that, we had Noah Fant and TJ Hawkinson, Harold Fannin right there above those guys as well. Again, we're going to add draft capital in, and once we do, that's going to shake things up for Fannin. But right now in the pre-draft model, it does love him. And again, I do think landing spot matters quite a bit for Harold Fannin Jr. because I don't think he's going to be used much, at least early on, as a pass blocker. So he needs to play somewhere that's willing to play him all the time, even though he may not be ready, as a run blocker, not a pass blocker.
Yeah, I mean, he's your ultimate move tight end. He's 238 pounds at the Senior Bowl. Unbelievable production. The most catches, the most receiving yards ever by a collegiate tight end in a single season. Ripped up Texas A&M, ripped up Penn State in his 2 games against big competition. So, yeah, Harold Fannin Jr., definitely one where that's going to get people very excited to see him as tight end 1 overall in this model. Dwayne, I told you 45 minutes. We're already at 55. Quick hitter question. Get off the rookies for a second. Give us a player that is going to break out next year in fantasy football that maybe dynasty managers should go ahead and try to trade for, or, if they're early best ball drafters, maybe draft this player.
Man, there's so many names we could go with here, but I'm just going to go with Jaylen Warren. It's because Najee could very easily be on the move. Now, maybe he won't be. I know Tomlin has said they want to bring him back, but I have a feeling someone's going to be willing to pay Najee probably a little bit too much in free agency. So he's going to be gone. And Jaylen Warren's been the guy we've been waiting on, Theo. We know that he can do everything. We know he's an explosive back. We know that he can play on passing downs. He really can be an every down back. Got hurt this last year, impacted some of his efficiency and things like that. But it's I think it's funny. I go look right now on Underdog and I'm like, man, essentially Jaylen Warren's going in the same place he was going last year in fantasy drafts. And Najee Harris is probably gone. So now Najee Harris returns, that changes things, obviously, and he's more back into being this back that may have a little bit of standalone value, but it's going to need an injury to Najee to really unlock things. But I think at least right now, I would rather be betting on, man, if Najee's gone, this is a player this probably going to move up instantly multiple rounds. Now, the NFL draft, a lot of players there. We talked about how deep the running back pool is, but I'll just say this. I think Jaylen Warren is good enough to still hold off a lot of these guys. And that goes back to saying that Ashton Jeanty is the elite guy that's available. If he lands in Pittsburgh, obviously, Jaylen Warren, sorry, ball game. It's over. So these things all come with risk, but say he avoids that. And any of these other backs that we talked about, I think there's a chance that Jaylen Warren could just hold them off for a year or two and be the every down guy. I think that's in the range of outcomes. He could also end up being in a timeshare, but in a timeshare where he gets more work because he's not sitting behind a guy they spent a first-round pick on where they feel they've got to justify playing a player like Najee Harris. So I would say that Jaylen Warren is the one that's the most interesting. The biggest risk, obviously, is how deep this class is. He could get some competition.
Every time we podcast together, it doesn't matter what the year is, we have to talk about Jaylen Warren at some point, Dwayne. So this could be the year, and he's super cheap right now. You can go offer a random third, and you're getting Jaylen Warren off of most dynasty managers right now. Dwayne, this was awesome. Let everybody know once again, they know where to follow you, but let them know once again where they can find your work.
Yeah, over at fantasylife.com, you can also check out the YouTube channel. We're putting out content constantly. Thor's obviously out putting out all of his content as well around the draft. So we are in draft mode, Theo. And again, I appreciate you having me on. Like I said, I just got the model together. So apologize if any of this was a little rough. I'm still fully getting my head around, the class after getting the model put together. My brain has literally been in testing, checking all these things, back testing things, and then just now getting these lists together. So it was good to get to come on, and get to talk about these guys a little bit. But yeah, fantasylife.com, folks can keep up with all the content that we've got coming out around the draft and the rookie class.
Yeah, back-to-back Dynasty Life episodes with Fantasy Life guests. Highly recommend the last episode I recorded with Thor Nystrom, where we revealed our top 10 positional rankings at running back, at wide receiver, and then our top 5 tight ends and quarterbacks. We're going to be dropping multiple Dynasty Lifes a week, heading right up to that NFL draft. We're going to get you ready to crush your Dynasty leagues this season.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.